The dawn that broke over Los Angeles that morning was neither peaceful nor forgiving. It was the kind of light that exposed everything: cracks in walls, bruises beneath eyes, and the remnants of illusions people spent years building. Somewhere behind high concrete walls and rusted bars, Luna Nozawa watched that light for the first time in months and convinced herself it was a sign. To everyone else, she was a murderer, an unstable woman who had killed two men, one she believed to be her father and another who had the misfortune of being a witness. But to Luna, she was the misunderstood heroine of her own story, a victim of fate and family who had been punished for loving too deeply. She wasn't escaping prison. She was reclaiming destiny. For weeks, Luna had been planning it, watching, waiting, memorizing routines like lines in a play. The guards joked, the inmates bickered, and the mechanical hum of daily life masked the quiet machinery of her obsession. Her cell walls were covered with small sketches, faces she remembered, fragments of Will Spencer's eyes, his hands, his voice. To her, Will was no longer just a man. He was the light outside her window, the promise of normalcy, of belonging, of love that would finally redeem her sins. Each time she whispered his name under her breath, she felt the pulse of life inside her belly, the child she carried, whom she believed would tie her fate to his forever. Then came the moment. It wasn't divine or cinematic. It was chaos. A fight broke out in the prison yard, raw, ugly, human chaos. While others screamed and ran, Luna saw opportunity. The laundry truck stood near the gate, its back open, steam rising from the white sheets like ghostly banners. Without hesitation, she slipped through the confusion, heart pounding, breath ragged. She climbed inside, buried herself beneath a mountain of linens, and prayed. Minutes later, the gate opened, the truck rolled forward, and the sound of the world outside grew louder, freer. When the brakes finally hissed to a stop, Luna's trembling fingers pushed the sheets aside, and there it was, sunlight. Real, blinding, merciless sunlight. Her escape wasn't elegant or planned to perfection. It was primal, desperate, inevitable. Every heartbeat screamed that this was her rebirth. She didn't think about how far she had to run or what awaited her. She thought only of Will, of his house by the sea, the one she had memorized through the photographs her former guard stole had foolishly shown her on social media. That house had become a symbol, a mirage she believed she was destined to reach. The ocean, the sand, the horizon, all of it belonged to her future. Meanwhile, news of her escape traveled fast. Deputy Chief Bradley Baker's phone rang before sunrise, and within hours, the world of the Spencers was in turmoil. Will Spencer, once the picture of calm privilege, now stood in his beach house with the windows sealed and security tightened, reading headlines that made his blood run cold. Convicted killer Luna Nozawa escapes custody, believed to be armed and dangerous. But Will knew better. Luna didn't need a weapon. She was one. Her mind was sharper than steel, her obsession deeper than logic, and her belief that he loved her was her most lethal delusion. Electra Forrester tried to hide her fear, but Will could see it in the way she lingered near the doors, in the way her laughter sounded forced when she said they were safe. The irony wasn't lost on him. Once upon a time, Luna had been the one Electra pitted, a broken girl lost in her own fantasies. Now she was a ghost haunting every shadow of their home. Baker assembled a search team immediately. Helicopters scoured the coastline. Wally Finnegan and Poppy Nozawa arrived at the scene, faces drawn with dread. For Lee, this was an echo of professional shame, a reminder that science and sanity had failed to contain a mind like Luna's. For Poppy, it was something darker. Luna was her daughter, her blood, and yet she was the living embodiment of every mistake she'd ever made. The thought that Luna might die, or worse, kill again, was a nightmare too unbearable to face. As the manhunt intensified, Luna moved through the outskirts of Los Angeles, like a phantom. The city, once her prison, now felt alive beneath her bare feet. She cut her hair with a broken mirror, stole a jacket from a laundromat, and walked for miles with nothing but delusion to guide her. Each mile brought her closer to the ocean, and with each step, her reality fractured further. She imagined Will waiting for her, arms open, forgiveness shining in his eyes. She imagined their child, the proof of their eternal connection. The line between hope and madness had long since disappeared. By the time she reached the cliffs overlooking the Pacific, the sun was sinking low, casting the sea in molten gold. Below her, she could see the beach house, Will's refuge, its glass walls glinting like a promise. Luna's heart swelled. It was beautiful, untouched, everything she had dreamed. She crouched behind the rocks, watching the silhouettes move inside, whispering his name under her breath.
Will.
It wasn't a call. It was a prayer. Inside, Will stood by the window, the reflection of the sunset painting his face in fractured light. He had told himself she wouldn't make it this far. He had told himself she'd be caught within hours. But deep down, he knew Luna's madness gave her endurance that sanity never could. When Baker's men reported a sighting near the coast, Will felt the inevitable weight settle in his chest. He wasn't just being hunted by Luna, he was being haunted by his own past with her, the decisions, the pity, the brief moments of weakness that had once blurred the boundaries between compassion and connection. Poppy arrived just before midnight, shaking and exhausted. She begged to join the search. Baker warned her that Luna might not even recognize her anymore, that her mind had fractured beyond reach. But Poppy insisted. She needed to try. Maybe a mother's voice could still pull her daughter back from the edge. The storm broke soon after, wind thrashing against the cliffs, waves slamming into the rocks below. The world seemed to conspire with Luna's turmoil, the chaos outside mirroring the tempest inside her head. She crept closer to the house, barefoot, soaked, trembling. The glow from the windows beckoned like salvation. Through the glass, she saw Will, his frame tall, calm, unshaken. Her heart leapt.
He hadn't changed.
He still belonged to her. But the image of Electra beside him shattered that illusion. The sight of another woman in her place snapped the final thread of her sanity. Jealousy, grief, and rage fused into one uncontrollable impulse. Luna stumbled forward, pounding on the glass, screaming his name. The sound cut through the storm like a siren. Inside, Electra froze. Will turned, disbelief flashing across his face as he saw the dripping figure outside the door. For a heartbeat, time stopped, the past and present colliding in one impossible moment. Baker's voice shouted through the radio in the next room. "We've got movement near the property. Possible suspect confirmed." But Will couldn't move fast enough. Luna forced the door open, rain pouring in behind her. Her eyes burned with something almost holy, a mixture of love and hatred so raw it bordered on divine. She stumbled forward, clutching her stomach. "You left me," she cried, though no one had said a word. "You left us." Poppy reached the house moments later, just in time to see the scene unfold. Her daughter, unrecognizable, wild-eyed and trembling. Her son-in-law's face pale with terror. She screamed Luna's name, but Luna barely flinched. She was lost in her own reality, trapped in a film only she could see. "Luna," Will said finally, his voice breaking, "you have to stop." But reason was useless. The storm outside roared as if the world itself wanted to drown her words. She backed away, shaking, torn between love and destruction. Then suddenly, pain tore through her body. She gasped, her knees buckling, blood staining the floor. The baby, the child she believed would bind them forever, was now tearing her apart. Chaos erupted. Will rushed forward, catching her before she hit the ground. Poppy screamed for help. Baker's men stormed in, weapons drawn, but froze at the sight of the convulsing woman bleeding in Will's arms. In that moment, Luna's delusion flickered. The rage softened. The obsession dimmed. She looked up at Will, her eyes glassy. "I just wanted us to be real," she whispered. Then everything went still. They rushed her to the hospital, sirens wailing against the wind. For a moment, it seemed she might survive. The doctors worked tirelessly, voices sharp with urgency. Poppy stood outside the operating room, clutching her rosary, whispering prayers between sobs. Will sat in silence, his shirt stained with her blood, unable to tell whether the heaviness in his chest was grief or guilt. Hours later, the surgeon emerged, eyes heavy. Luna had suffered a cerebral hemorrhage during the operation. The baby hadn't survived. The words landed like stones, final, merciless, absolute. Poppy collapsed into tears, while Will felt something in him hollow out completely. It wasn't relief. It wasn't sorrow. It was an emptiness that felt too vast to name. The next morning, news broke across the city. Luna Nozawa dead after prison escape and failed surgery. The world reacted with a mix of fascination and exhaustion. For the public, it was another tragic headline. For Will, it was a scar that would never heal. Days passed, but the image of Luna's face in that final moment refused to fade. Her eyes had held something more complex than madness. They had held hope, as misguided as it was. And now, that hope was gone, leaving behind only ghosts. Electra tried to comfort him, but the distance between them widened. She couldn't understand why he seemed more broken than relieved. She didn't know that part of him still replayed the what-ifs. What if he had helped her sooner? What if he had acknowledged her illness? What if compassion had saved her instead of fear? But deep down, he knew none of it would have mattered. Luna's tragedy had begun long before the prison walls. She had been born into chaos, raised in shadows, and taught that love meant control. Poppy visited the morgue alone. She stared at her daughter's lifeless body, pale and still, and felt a strange peace. The monster was gone, but so was the child she once cradled. She whispered an apology for being too weak, for letting her slip into darkness, and left without looking back. At the beach house, silence returned. The waves rolled against the shore, erasing footprints, washing away traces of blood. Will stood by the window again, staring at the ocean that had witnessed everything. It should have felt like freedom, but it felt like punishment. He realized that Luna had never been entirely wrong. There had been a connection between them, fragile and unspoken, built on pity and misunderstanding. But love built on illusion was doomed to devour itself. As days turned into weeks, Will found himself haunted not by what had happened, but by what it revealed about him. He had seen himself reflected in Luna's obsession, the same human hunger for control, for validation, for meaning. She had been a distorted mirror, showing him the parts of himself he wished didn't exist. The story of Luna Nozawa ended not with violence, but with inevitability. Her escape had never been about freedom. It had been a journey back to the man who had unknowingly defined her existence. She had sought love and found death, but in a twisted way, it was the only ending her story could have had. Poppy moved away after the funeral, unable to bear the whispers that followed her. Baker closed the case with a sigh, another tragedy on his record. Electra and Will tried to rebuild, but every creak of the waves at night sounded like Luna's voice, soft, pleading, eternal. Sometimes, when the wind blew from the sea, Will swore he could hear her laugh, faint and fleeting, carried away by the tide. Not mocking, not angry,
Just lost.
and as he stood there, watching the horizon swallow the sun, he realized that some ghosts don't haunt to torment, they haunt to remind. That love, when twisted by desperation, becomes the cruelest prison of all. When Thomas Forrester stepped off the plane at LAX, the air smelled different, salted, warm, heavy with nostalgia, and something cruelly familiar. He hadn't planned on returning to Los Angeles so soon, but Thanksgiving had always been an invisible tether that drew him back to his family, no matter how far he ran. The Forrester name was a legacy that lingered in every fiber of who he was: beautiful, broken, and impossible to escape. He had spent months in another city convincing himself that distance was healing, that solitude was growth, and that time would erode the last traces of Hope Logan from his mind. But the moment he saw her name on his phone screen, buried in a headline about her new engagement to Liam Spencer, the fragile architecture of his piece collapsed. The article was simple, almost banal. Hope Logan and Liam Spencer reunited. The couple is engaged again. But those words, engaged again, punctured Thomas like a blade twisting through the ribs of restraint. He read it once, twice, and by the third time, he wasn't even seeing the words anymore. He saw images. Hope's smile as she said yes, Liam's hand sliding that ring onto her finger, the circle of gold glinting like mockery under the California sun. He closed his eyes, and behind his eyelids the ring gleamed again, this time on her hand as she laughed, turning toward another man's kiss. By the time he reached the Forrester mansion for the family dinner, his pulse was a slow, steady thrum of denial. His mother's warm greeting barely registered. Steffi's cautious eyes pierced him, and Ridge's usual mix of pride and warning seemed to echo in a distant room. He moved through the house like a ghost, every corner whispering memory. Hope in the design studio, Hope's perfume lingering after fittings, Hope's voice telling him she believed in his artistic vision when no one else did. He told himself he had changed, that therapy and time had rewired his impulses. But obsession was not a wound that healed. It was a vine that adapted, burrowing deeper into the spaces he thought he'd reclaimed. He caught sight of the television in the corner. On it, Hope and Liam's interview replayed. They were smiling for the press, speaking of second chances and forgiveness. Hope's voice was gentle, full of conviction, and Liam's arm rested lightly on her shoulder. The entire world saw happiness. Thomas saw betrayal. The words second chance echoed in his head like a cruel inside joke. He had begged for one for years, and she had given it to Liam. Again. Something in him split. It wasn't dramatic or violent. It was quiet, clean, almost clinical. He excused himself from the table under the guise of needing air and stepped outside into the cold November evening. The night wrapped around him like a confession he couldn't speak aloud. His reflection in the glass doors didn't look angry. It looked empty. But that emptiness was the birthplace of something far more dangerous than rage. It was clarity, sharp and thin as glass. Thomas told himself he was only going to congratulate her, to see her once, to prove that he was strong enough to face her happiness without unraveling. But the lie was so transparent it almost insulted him. He wasn't going to see her. He was going to study her, to understand how she could move on so completely, how she could erase the man who once nearly broke himself to worship her. He had been her creative partner, her emotional confidant, the architect of her dreams. Liam was merely comfort. Ordinary. Predictable. Safe. When he finally saw her again at Forrester Creations, the universe held its breath. Hope looked radiant, not in the ethereal way he remembered, but grounded, luminous, untouchable. The ring sparkled on her hand as she gestured while talking to her team, her laughter echoing softly through the design floor. It wasn't the sound he remembered. It was brighter, lighter. As if the weight of all they had shared no longer lived inside her. That sound tore something vital inside him. She turned and saw him. For a brief second, her eyes widened, surprise, warmth, a flicker of nostalgia. But then came the smile. Polite. Professional. Detached.
Thomas.
You're back. Just words. Words that burned because they were hollow, stripped of intimacy. In that moment, Thomas's world rearranged itself. Every memory, every fantasy, every suppressed emotion rose to the surface, forming a single unrelenting truth. She was supposed to be his. Every instinct he had buried under therapy and restraint surged forward like a tide breaking a dam. He smiled back, but the gesture barely reached his eyes. The air between them thickened, charged with something only he could feel. The days that followed blurred into a slow descent. Thomas became omnipresent in Hope's life again, but under the pretext of professionalism. He told himself it was harmless. He was her creative partner on the Hope for the Future line, after all. It made sense for them to spend long hours together, revisiting fabrics, sketches, themes. Yet beneath that surface of normalcy, his mind was a constant hum of rationalizations. He watched her talk about wedding plans while he adjusted the hemline of a dress, each mention of Liam's name slicing through him. Every word about venues, rings, and flowers was a dagger wrapped in silk. He began to study Liam from a distance, too. The way he spoke to Hope, the way he hesitated when asked about commitment, the way he laughed just a fraction too loudly at Brooke's jokes. Thomas cataloged every flaw, every hesitation, every potential weakness. He wasn't jealous, he told himself. He was concerned. Concerned that Hope was about to make another mistake. Concerned that she was too forgiving, too hopeful for a man who didn't deserve her. The delusion was gentle, even noble in his own mind. He wasn't sabotaging, he was saving. The human mind has a way of disguising obsession as devotion. In Thomas's case, it cloaked itself in logic. He told himself that he could help Hope see the truth if he just reminded her, subtly, of how often Liam had failed her. He slipped reminders into conversation, a design sketch with a hidden symbol, a playlist that mirrored their past collaborations, casual comments about trust and reliability. He fed her doubts like breadcrumbs, each one small enough to seem innocent. Hope didn't notice at first. Or perhaps she did and chose to ignore it, hoping Thomas's newfound maturity would keep him contained. But containment was never the same as control. It wasn't long before Steffi noticed. Her brother's energy shifted. The calmness that had once defined his recovery was gone, replaced by the old restless gleam in his eyes. She confronted him gently, trying to remind him of everything he'd worked for, everything he'd nearly lost. But Thomas's mind had already built its fortress of justifications. He wasn't delusional, he was inspired. He wasn't manipulating, he was protecting. He wasn't regressing, he was fighting for what was right. And once that narrative solidified, there was no pulling him back. Thanksgiving arrived, a cruel irony, a day meant for gratitude, now tainted by longing and deceit. The Forster mansion was alight with warmth, laughter, and the soft clinking of champagne glasses. Hope and Liam arrived together, radiating contentment. Their fingers intertwined, their smiles unguarded. Thomas watched from across the room, his expression serene but his heartbeat erratic. Every gesture between them fed his internal storm. When Hope leaned into Liam's shoulder, Thomas's hand tightened around his glass until it cracked, blood blooming from a cut he didn't even feel. After dinner, the conversations turned casual, but his mind churned. He began to imagine scenarios, tiny fractures he could create, subtle manipulations that could unravel the engagement without anyone realizing his hand in it. What if he hinted to Liam that Hope had been confiding in him again, reigniting Liam's insecurities? What if he reminded Hope that Liam's loyalty had wavered before, that people rarely change? What if he engineered small coincidences, text messages, misplaced items, misinterpreted moments, to make them doubt each other? He wouldn't have to destroy their relationship. He'd simply guide it towards self-destruction. The thought thrilled and horrified him in equal measure. But beneath all those schemes was a darker whisper. If I can't have her, no one should. It started as an echo, faint and fleeting, but it grew louder with every encounter. Hope's presence was intoxicating, her scent familiar yet foreign, her laughter a melody that tormented him. The engagement ring became an emblem of defiance, glimmering mockingly whenever her hand caught the light. In his mind, he began to replace Liam in every image, photos, memories, fantasies. He saw himself in the tuxedo, standing beside her, her smile directed at him. Reality bent under the pressure of his need. Soon, his fixation began bleeding into his work. Designs for Hope for the future took on a darker tone. Romantic silhouettes turned possessive, wedding gowns with corsets that looked like cages, veils that resembled shrouds. The collection was hauntingly beautiful but unsettling, like love viewed through the lens of obsession. When Hope complimented the creativity, Thomas felt a flicker of victory. She didn't even realize she was wearing his madness like silk. Liam, ever perceptive to threats around Hope, began to sense something off. He confronted Hope, gently at first, suggesting distance from Thomas. Hope defended Thomas.